Hello everybody. Welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper reading. Today we'll be discussing the New Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper dated 8th March 2020. Topics to be discussed are displayed on the screen and timestamping for the same are given in the description box below. So let's start. Now, this article appears on page number 11 and relates to a survey that highlights the prevalence of sexual harassment at workplace in the media industry. Now, the details of this survey that is conducted by the Network of Women in Media India is too narrow from the perspective of examination. The issue of sexual harassment at workplace in general is extremely important for your mains examination under multiple papers, including General Studies Paper 1, Paper 2, and the ethics paper, where often questions are asked based on multiple issues related to women in India. Now, for instance, in the recently concluded mains examination, there was a question on violence against women along time and space in General Studies Paper 1, and in 2013, there was a case study in the General Studies Paper 4 directly related to sexual harassment at workplace. Now, recently, in the backdrop of the Me Too movement, the Government of India constituted a group of ministers under the leadership of the Home Minister in 2018 to review the working of Sexual Harassment at Workplace Act of 2013, which has come out with the recommendations in Jan 2020. Now, though the recommendations are not yet published in the public domain, the group of ministers has recommended for stricter and tougher laws to deal with sexual harassment at workplace. And therefore, this topic becomes extremely important from the perspective of mains examination, particularly in the year 2020. Now, thus, as a part of this news analysis, let us understand the issue of sexual harassment at workplace in the following framework. Now, first of all, I will be dealing with a general framework to understand sexual harassment. Now, this framework is in accordance with the Vishaka guidelines of the Supreme Court. Now, it should be noted that till 1997, when the Vishaka guidelines was laid down by the Honorable Supreme Court, there was no law in India that dealt exclusively with sexual harassment at workplace. So we will be looking at the spirit of Vishaka guidelines, after which we will also have a look at the Sexual Harassment at Workplace Act that was enacted in 2013. And finally, we will look at some of the challenges for effective implementation of the Sexual Harassment at Workplace Act. In addition, we will be covering the recommendations of the group of ministers as and when the recommendations are put out in the public domain. So let us look at these details one by one. Now, the Constitution of India, particularly the Preamble and Part 3 guaranteeing the fundamental rights, encompass within its ambit the entire facet of gender equality in general. Now, as a result, a safe workplace for women is an essential aspect of gender equality that are enshrined in various parts of the Constitution. Now, as a result, the sexual harassment perpetrated against women is essentially an infringement of fundamental rights of women guaranteed under Article 14 that provides for right to equality, Article 15 that provides protection against all forms of discrimination, and Article 21 that guarantees right to dignified life and personal liberty. Now, in addition, Article 19(1)(g) provides for the fundamental right to practice any profession across India. Now, in addition, sexual harassment also amounts to violence against women, which has its roots in the patriarchal attitudes that reinforce the domination of men over women in general. Now, the sexual harassment, which amounts to both violation of women's rights and violence against women, is one of the leading factors for lower productivity of women and low labor force participation rates. Now, as highlighted by the recent economic survey, the female labor force participation is around 23% in India, and sexual harassment is one of the leading factors for the same. Now, the low productivity and low labor force participation rates of women leads to gender role stereotyping, confining them to domestic sphere, leading to a denigration of their productive value. Now, the gender role stereotyping, which is prevalent across various institutions, will further perpetrate the patriarchal attitudes, which is one of the leading causes of incidents of sexual harassment at workplace in general. Now, therefore, the vicious cycle of sexual harassment at workplace can be seen as a continuum in which sexual harassment is thought of as both violation of rights and violence against women, which is a serious dent on their productivity, which in turn reinforces the low productive value of women in society in general and continues to confine them to domestic sphere, leading to reinforcement of gender role stereotyping, which in turn perpetrates the patriarchal attitudes of the society, which is seen as a leading cause for sexual harassment in India. Now, in addition, it should be noted that India ratified the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which is popularly called as CEDA, which is considered as the International Bill of Rights for Women. Now, therefore, a safe working place is a woman's legal right, and sexual harassment is one of the leading hindrances for creation of a safe workplace for women in general. Now, having understood the continuum of sexual harassment at workplace, let us have a look at the evolution of laws dealing with sexual harassment at workplace, starting with the Vishaka Guidelines. Now, the Vishaka Guidelines of 1997 was a culmination of a public interest litigation that was filed in 1992 that sought to recognize sexual harassment as a violation of women's fundamental right to equality. Now, till 1997, as I've mentioned before, there was no law in India specifically dealing with sexual harassment at workplace. Now, the genesis of this PIL was the harassment faced by Banwari Devi, a rural level change agent in the state of Rajasthan who was working towards prevention of child marriages. Now, as a response to this PIL, in a landmark judgment, the Supreme Court of India created legally binding guidelines popularly called as Vishaka Guidelines to deal with sexual harassment at workplace. Now, the principles of Vishaka Guidelines was adopted in the Sexual Harassment at Workplace Prevention, Prohibition and Redressal Act in 2013. Now, thus, the Sexual Harassment of Women at Workplace Prevention, Prohibition and Redressal Act was enacted to ensure safe working spaces for women and build an enabling working environment that respect women's right to equality of status and opportunity as enshrined in the preamble of the Indian Constitution. Now, coming to the important provisions of the Act defines sexual harassment as any unwelcome acts, physical contact or advances, demand or request for sexual favors, sexually colored remarks, showing pornography or any other unwelcome physical, verbal or non-verbal conduct of sexual nature to constitute sexual harassment. Now, it is important to note that the definition of sexual harassment constitutes four important aspects, including any behavior of sexual nature that is unwelcome, and the act or the behavior should be sexual in nature. Besides, an unwelcome act is subjective in nature, and therefore the focus is on the impact of the act rather than the intent of the perpetrator. Now, which simply means that the definition of sexual harassment under the Act covers a wide ambit of behavior, focusing completely on the impact of unwelcome acts on the victim, irrespective of the intention of the perpetrator of the act. Now, besides, the Act applies to all women at workplace, including those working, those who are visiting, or in case of educational institutions, the students. Now, besides, the workplace constitutes both organized and unorganized sector. Now, as I have mentioned before, the Act puts an obligation on the institution rather than individuals to deal with sexual harassment at workplace. Now, as I've stated before, the Act shifts the accountability towards institutions rather than individuals to deal with sexual harassment at workplace, and therefore puts an obligation on the employer to take necessary steps for prohibition, prevention, and redressal of grievances. Now, accordingly, the Act puts an obligation on the employer to create and communicate a detailed policy which prohibits unwelcome behavior, create awareness about the policy, and lay out a detailed framework for redressal within the scope of the policy. Now, besides, the employer is also obligated to ensure awareness and orientation on the issue of sexual harassment. The employer is to constitute complaints committee that is responsible for inquiry of sexual harassment cases. Now, under this, as I have said, the Act applies to both organized and unorganized sector, and therefore the complaints committee for formal employment is internal complaints committee that is constituted within the organization. Now, it is important to note that the composition of internal complaints committee include at least 50% of its member as women. The chairperson of the internal complaints committee is to be headed by women, and finally the term of ICC would be 3 years. Now, similarly, in case of unorganized sector and organizations where the number of employees are less than 10, a local complaints committee is constituted under the district officer who is to be appointed by the district magistrate. The local complaints committee also deal with cases related to domestic workers. Now, in addition, the employers are also obligated to provide for training for the members of complaints committee, prepare an annual report highlighting the status of the sexual harassment cases, and also take actions in a time-bound manner in case of incidents of sexual harassment. Now, in addition, the Act provides for an innovative redressal mechanism that is to be adopted in the policies related to sexual harassment at workplace. Accordingly, any incidents of sexual harassment shall be reported to the internal complaints committee so constituted within 3 months of the last incident. Now, upon receiving the complaint, the internal complaint committee within 7 days sends a notice to the respondents who are to reply within 10 days before the inquiry begins. Now, the notice is sent both to the alleged victim and the accused. Now, once the reply is given, the internal complaints committee undertakes a rigorous inquiry process which has to be completed within 90 days. Now, based on the findings of the inquiry, a report is prepared within 10 days which needs to be implemented by the employer within 60 days of receiving the report. Now, besides, the person against whom the complaint is lodged has an appeals mechanism that can be exercised within 90 days from the day the report is submitted. Now, besides, it is important to note that a complaint that is lodged with a malified intention is an offence under the Act. Now, thus, the sexual harassment at workplace was enacted in the spirit of the Vishaka Guidelines, providing for an exclusive law to deal with sexual harassment at workplace. Now, the detailed discussion with respect to the provisions of Sexual Harassment Act is covered keeping in mind the nature of questions that have appeared in the mains examination in the previous years. Now, for instance, this question that has appeared in 2013 in the form of a case study required an understanding of the definition of sexual harassment and the redressal mechanism in order to answer the question. Now, as you can see, this question read, you are the executive director of an upcoming infotech company which is making a name for itself in the market. Mr. A, who is a star performer, is heading the marketing team, and in a year, he has helped doubling the revenues as well as creating a high brand equity for the company. Now, however, you have been receiving information from many corners about his attitude towards female colleagues, particularly his habit of making loose comments and sending indecent SMSs to his female colleagues. Now, as it is clear, an understanding of the definition of sexual harassment under the Act is necessary for one to understand that these unwelcome behavior constitutes sexual harassment as defined under the Act. Now, in addition, as we have discussed, it is the impact on the victim and not the intention of the perpetrator that is in focus while defining sexual harassment under the Act. So, as you can see in this second paragraph, which says, one day late in the evening, Mrs. X, who is one of Mr. A's team members, comes to you visibly disturbed. She complains against continued misconduct who has been making undesirable advances. So, as it is clear, the impact of Mr. A's behavior is disturbance to Mrs. X and therefore constitutes sexual harassment as defined under the Sexual Harassment at Workplace Act. And thus the question demands you to list down the different options available and choose the best option giving reasons. Now, as a result, in answering this question, the first step that the executive director would have to take is to initiate the inquiry by Internal Complaints Committee. If Mrs. X has reported the event within 3 months of the incident, now she is eligible for the grievance redressal despite the fact that she has tendered her resignation because she has visited the office. Now, as you can remember, the Act applies to all category of women, including the employees and those that have visited the office in the course of work. And two, you may also recommend to intensify the awareness program with respect to sexual harassment, as only one of the female colleagues of Mr. A has reported an event, and there is a high probability that the other female colleagues have not reported due to lack of knowledge as to what constitutes sexual harassment. Now, thus, in the spirit of Vishaka guidelines, the Sexual Harassment at Workplace Act comprehensively covers any unwelcome behavior and focuses more on the impact on the victim rather than the intention of the perpetrator while defining sexual harassment. Now, before we look into the issues with the Act, as I've mentioned, there was a group of ministers that was formed in October 2018 in the aftermath of the Me Too movement in order to review the working of the law. Now, it is to be noted that the recommendations of the group of ministers that was headed by the Home Minister was made final in January 2020. However, the recommendations are not yet in the public domain and will be covering the same as and when it is published. Now, coming to the issues with the Act, one of the primary issues is that though the Act in essence is in the spirit of Vishaka guidelines, in terms of action, it is severely criticized for not laying down a clear-cut responsibility to fix accountability. This is to say that the Act does not specify who is in charge of ensuring the workplace comply with the Act, whether it is the CEO, the chairman, or the executive director. Now, besides, the fine that is imposed by the Act for non-compliance in case of sexual harassment, including non-compliance of constituting the Internal Complaints Committee, is extremely low at 50,000 and is not sufficient to enforce the obligation on the employer to take necessary actions. Now, besides, it is seen that a number of companies do not have Internal Complaints Committees set up and the monitoring for the same has been lax. Now, in addition, there is no clarity in the Act as to who will make the report and who will audit the report at the end of the year with respect to the complaints received. Now, one of the biggest issues is the lack of awareness as to what constitutes sexual harassment at workplace, particularly in the unorganized sector. Now, besides, Section 14, which provides for punishment against malicious complaints, is seen to be acting as a deterrent in filing complaints, and hence even Justice Verma Committee that was constituted to review the law in 2015 had recommended deletion of this provision. Now, besides, the law is criticized for not being gender neutral as it does not take into account sexual harassment faced by transgender and men. Now, having highlighted these issues, we will wait for the recommendations of group of ministers which has called for a stricter and tougher law to deal with sexual harassment at workplace. So thus, it is needless to say that this topic becomes extremely important from the perspective of mains examination, and you may use this news analysis as a framework to understand the issue of sexual harassment at workplace. Now with this, let's move to the next news. Now this article appears on page number 14 and relates to the recent decision of the Union government to divest its shares in some of the important public sector enterprises, including BPCL. Now, while the details of this news is not important from the perspective of examination, the concept of disinvestment, particularly strategic disinvestment, becomes important. Now, as a part of the news analysis of 22nd November 2019, we have covered the concept of strategic disinvestment in detail, and what I'll be doing here is attaching a part of the discussion for your revision. Now, this step is in line with the recent enthusiasm in the government to revive the process of disinvestment in India and becomes important from the perspective of General Studies Paper 3 under the head Government Budgeting and Liberalization of the Economy. Now, in its recent decision, the government has decided to divest its shares in the central public sector enterprises, including the Bharat Petroleum Corporation Limited, the Shipping Corporation, and the Container Corporation of India, in order to one, meet the fiscal targets of the government, and two, to infuse a market mechanism in these public sector enterprises in order to realize the full economic potential of these organizations. Now, this is done through a way of privatization, which includes both sale of shares to the private party and also transfer of management control. Now, this step is in line with the recent revival of the strategic disinvestment policy of the government, under which the government is all set to lose its control over some of the public sector enterprises in line with the philosophy of less government, more governance. Now, the decision to divest its shares in these public sector enterprises is on account of failure to meet its fiscal deficit targets due to low collection of tax revenue and non-tax revenue alike. In that, the tax revenue target that has been accomplished in this fiscal is only around 35%, and the non-tax revenue that is achieved so far is only 12,000 crores out of the target of 1,05,000 crores in this fiscal. As a result of failure to achieve these revenue targets, the fiscal deficit target of 3.3% seems to be unachievable now. As a result, in order to avoid this fiscal deficit slippage, the government has taken a decision to divest its shares in these public sector enterprises, which will enable the government to meet its fiscal deficit targets as well as infuse efficiency in this organization by way of privatization. Now, in this context, the author in this article is critical of the government move to divest its shares, especially in the Bharat Petroleum Corporation Limited, as it may lead to loss of dividends for the government. Now, besides, the author also highlights the timing of this disinvestment is too late, in that the proceeds of this step will only be realized beyond this fiscal, and thus requiring government to expedite this process of disinvestment in order to realize the proceeds as early as possible and avoid the resultant fiscal deficit slippage. Now, in this context, let us understand some basic terms related to this news article, including the difference between disinvestment, strategic disinvestment, and privatization. Besides, we'll also understand the evolution of disinvestment policy in India that will enable us to cover this topic in a holistic way. Now, in the aftermath of independence, the responsibility of national development was taken up by the government led by the public sector enterprises, given the underdeveloped stage of private sector as a result of colonialism. However, given the bureaucratization and red tapeism in these public sector enterprises and the resultant inefficiency, led to what is known as New Economic Policy of 1991, which is what we call as liberalization. One of the significant aspects of this policy of liberalization was the withdrawal of the government from some of these key public sector enterprises by way of shedding its ownership. Now, thus, disinvestment means sale of government shares in central public sector enterprises. On the other hand, when the government sells so many of these shares that it no longer remains the majority stakeholder of a given PSU, it amounts to what is called as privatization. Thus, while disinvestment is a generic term under which government decides to sell some of its shareholding in the public sector enterprise, under privatization, the government mandatorily has to sell so many shares that it no longer holds 51% shareholding in the public sector enterprise. Now, strategic disinvestment or strategic divestment is a fairly new concept under which the government not only sells its shares to the third party but also transfers the management control over the public sector enterprise. Now, in order to understand the difference between these terms, let us look at the policy of disinvestment in India. Now, as I've already mentioned, the disinvestment policy in India was adopted with the LPG reforms of 1991. Further, the disinvestment policy got consolidated between 1999 to 2004 in that a separate department for disinvestment was set up in 1999. Now, the proceeds of this disinvestment as a result of selling of government shares was accrued to a fund that was established called as National Investment Fund, which came into being in 2005. However, given the lack of political will and the reluctance of bureaucracy, the policy of disinvestment in this period has not yielded the desired results. Besides, it should be noted that the political and the bureaucratic control over these public sector enterprises has resulted in red tapeism and resultant inefficiency in these public sector enterprises. As a result, India being a market economy, and in order for these public sector enterprises to realize the full potential of the market mechanism, the need was felt to revive this policy of disinvestment and hand over these public sector enterprises to private sector and thus the market mechanism. As a result, the policy of disinvestment was revived in the year 2016, which was initiated by renaming the Department of Disinvestment into Department of Disinvestment and Public Asset Management, which is popularly called as DIPAM. Now, given the profit motive of private sector, some of the strategic sectors that affect a large part of the population continue to be under larger government control, and the non-strategic public sector enterprises were thrown open for private participation. However, given the changing nature of the economy and inefficiency that has crept in these public sector enterprises, the government has felt the need for reviving this disinvestment policy in India today. Accordingly, under the current policy, the government has differentiated between disinvestment and strategic disinvestment. Now, under strategic disinvestment, the transfer of shares and transfer of management control is done to a strategic partner who could be a private entity or another public sector enterprise. Now, in case the strategic partner that is chosen by the government is a private entity, it amounts to what is called as privatization, under which both the shares and the management control of the public sector enterprise is transferred to private sector entity. Thus, strategic disinvestment is not necessarily privatization, and privatization is only a case of strategic disinvestment, under which the strategic partner chosen is a private entity. Besides, as it is clear, the objective of strategic disinvestment or disinvestment in general is twofold. One is refurbishing the government finances through the sale of government shares in public sector enterprises. Another is to bring in efficiency in these organizations to realize their full potential by way of privatization. Besides, given the inevitability of government control over certain key sectors that affect the national security and the population in general, the sectors that are chosen for disinvestment have to be carefully scrutinized. Now, in order for identification of these sectors for strategic disinvestment is done through an interministerial body headed by the finance minister and is called as alternative mechanism that was introduced in 2017. Thus, this interministerial body called alternative mechanism identifies the sectors for disinvestment, also identifies the strategic partner and other terms and conditions for transfer of shares and management control to the strategic partner. Now, having understood the difference between strategic disinvestment and privatization, let us understand the advantages of disinvestment as a whole. Now, as I've already mentioned, due to red tapeism and inefficiency, a number of public sector enterprises have become sick units and the process of this disinvestment will help winding up of these sick units. Besides, transfer of management control to a private entity will help infuse best technology and management practices in line with the global best practices that is much needed in the changing economy today. Further, withdrawal of government control in these public sector enterprises will allow them to participate in the market mechanism and achieve full economic potential and make them competitive. Further, the proceeds of disinvestment adds to the kitty of the non-tax revenue of the government, thereby managing the fiscal deficits to the acceptable levels. Now, withdrawal of government control and bringing in private sector through the policy of disinvestment, particularly strategic disinvestment, is much in line with the government philosophy of less government and more governance, or in other words, laissez-faire. However, given the profit motive of the private sector, some of the concerns of disinvestment in general is loss of revenue for the government, particularly from those profit-making public sectors, as the government is said to lose out dividends of these profit-making companies, which is highlighted in the article. Besides, bringing in private sector may also create loss of jobs in these public sector enterprises that is known to be a major employer in the economy. Besides, while the alternative mechanism that we discussed will expedite the process of disinvestment, a clear selection criteria for choosing the strategic partner has to be given, which is currently done case to case basis. Notwithstanding the advantages of disinvestment, the profit motive of private sector may not yield in redistribution of resources in a country like India that suffers from a problem of large inequality. Now, as a result, as it is clear from our discussion, in a changing economy, the government, in line with its philosophy of less government and more governance, should expose these public sector enterprises to market mechanism to realize their full economic potential through the policy of disinvestment, but should also be in line with the long-term vision through strategic disinvestment, making these public sector enterprises efficient and competitive as per the demands of the time. Now, having understood the policy of disinvestment in India in a holistic manner, let's move to the next news. Now, this article appears on page number 1 and relates to the next generation electoral reforms. Now, the Election Commission of India, in the aftermath of the recent Lok Sabha election, had constituted a number of working groups in order to recommend the next generation electoral reforms. Now, accordingly, the working groups have recommended a 25-point action plan for revamping the electoral administration in the country. Now, accordingly, this topic becomes important from the perspective of General Studies Paper 2 under the subsection Salient Features of Representation of People's Act. Now, as a part of this news analysis, let us have a look at some of the most important electoral reforms that have been recommended by the Election Commission of India. Now, the first among the recommendations is a cap on the political party expenditure that the Election Commission has recommended. Now, it should be noted that the Conduct of Election Rules 1961 imposes a limit on an individual candidate's expenditure during election. However, there is no cap on the total political party expenditure. Now, as a result, there is no level playing field between the political parties in the electoral process. Now, therefore, the Election Commission of India has put a cap on the maximum expenditure by a political party at the individual limit, which is around 70 lakh for big states today, into the total number of candidates that are contesting from a particular political party. Now, as mentioned, the cap on political party expenditure ensures a level playing field among all political parties. It prevents the flow of black money. Further, it reduces the influence of money power in the electoral process. Now, the second among the recommendations is the regulation of print and social media. Now, it should be noted that Section 126 of Representation of People's Act 1951 prohibits election campaign by way of advertisements through television, radio, etc. during the period of 48 hours ending with the hour fixed for the close of the poll. Now, however, Section 126 of the Representation of People's Act does not cover print media and social media, and thus the Election Commission of India has recommended inclusion of print and social media under Section 126. Now, it should be noted that the recent general election of 2019 saw the highest voter percentage at 67% in the electoral history of India. However, according to estimates, there are still about 30% of the electors who are unable to vote either due to migration or due to number of other factors. Now, as a result, the working groups have recommended introduction of new voting methods in order to increase the voter percentage in the electoral process. Now, while the Election Commission has emphasized the need for adoption of new voting methods, it does not specify as to what constitutes these new voting methods. Now, one alternative for new voting methods could be integration of biometric based voting with blockchain technology that can take care of voting from remote places. Now, next among the measures is some of the e-governance measures. Now, presently, the candidates file their nomination in person before the concerned returning officer, which should be replaced by online nomination according to the working groups. Besides, we can kickstart the registration of prospective voters right from 17 years of age and make the registration online. Besides, the Election Commission has also recommended the introduction of e-voter cards to replace the present EPIC. Now, next among the recommendations is with respect to a single simplified form for all services to voters, including change, registration, deletion, etc., similar to what has been done with the passports. Now, in addition, as in case of some countries like Australia, the Election Commission can provide for doorstep delivery of electoral services, particularly to persons with disability and senior citizens. Now, in another important step, the Election Commission has also recommended revamping of booth level officer system and creating a dedicated cadre of booth level officers who can play multiple roles at the booth level. Now, as you must be aware, currently the booth level officers are government employees working in the local or the state government who are aware of the local conditions, and thus creating a dedicated booth level officer cadre will lead to better management of the booth during election, higher voter registration in the electoral rolls, and spreading of electoral literacy among the masses, thereby enhancing the voter awareness in the country. Now, as I have said, this topic becomes extremely important from the perspective of mains examination. Now, the recommendations of the working groups of Election Commission of India have been put up in the public domain for feedback and suggestions, and as and when the reforms are introduced, we'll be covering as a part of our DNS analysis. Now, with this, let's move to the practice questions. Now, this question is framed on the basis of this article that appears on page number 16 related to sunspots. Now, while this article talks about the details of a new sunspot cycle, what is important from the perspective of examination is regarding the sunspots. Now, the sunspots are areas on the sun which have strong magnetic fields and therefore appear darker compared to the surrounding areas. Now, these magnetic fields prevent the heat from reaching the surface of the sun from its interior. Now, the sunspots usually have a cycle of 11 years and basically is a proof for rotation of the sun as was observed by Galileo. Now, accordingly, this question is framed which reads, consider the following statements regarding sunspots. They are source of solar flares, which is incorrect, and 2, they serve as markers for rotation of the sun, which is true, and hence the correct option is B, 2 only. Now, this question is also framed on the basis of this article that appears on page number 16 with respect to genome sequencing of the SARS coronavirus 2. Now, India recently has shared the genome sequence data of the novel coronavirus with the Global Initiative on Sharing All Influenza Data, or GISAID. Now, it is said that the genome sequencing of the virus helps us understand how these viruses evolve, spread, and become a pandemic. As a result, the GISAID enables international sharing of genome sequencing of viruses by countries worldwide. Now, accordingly, this question reads, consider the following statements with respect to Global Initiative on Sharing All Influenza Data. It promotes international sharing of all influenza virus gene sequences, which is correct. It functions under the aegis of WHO, which is incorrect, and therefore the right option is A, 1 only. Now, with this, we come to the end of today's discussion. Now let's take up the question for the day. Now the question for the day reads, consider the following statements about strategic disinvestment in India. It's a step towards reducing fiscal deficit. 2. It involves selling of government shares in PSUs to private sector. Which of the statements given above is or are correct? A. 1 only. B. 2 only. C. Both 1 and 2. D. None of the above.